At my own son's wedding, I was seated near the kitchen doors, my name misspelled on the place card as if I barely mattered. I watched him stand beneath the glittering lights, raise his glass, and thank his wife's mother, calling her his real mom in front of everyone. I smiled like I always had, like a mother who knows her place. But inside, something quietly shattered. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I whispered to myself, I don't have to live like this anymore. My name is Gloria Benson, and I've always considered myself an ordinary woman from a quiet town called Maplewood, a sleepy little place with more pine trees than people and where everybody knows everybody's business. I never minded the quiet. I thought my life would be simple. Steady shifts at the local hospital, maybe some traveling later in life, perhaps even meeting someone special along the way. But life rarely follows the plans we make. At 25, everything changed. It was a rainy afternoon in early March when the phone rang. I remember the static in the dispatcher's voice, the cold way the words cut through me. My younger sister and her husband, gone in an instant. A car accident just 2 towns over. They didn't make it. I could barely process it, but then came the next sentence, the one that altered the course of my entire life. There's a child, a boy, 5 years old. That boy was Aiden. I still remember rushing to the hospital, hair-dripping shoes, squelching my uniform, clinging to me after a 12-hour shift. I found Aiden sitting on a gurney, his tiny hands gripping his knees, face streaked with tears and soot. He just kept whispering, "Mommy, Mommy," over and over again like a prayer too fragile to be answered. They told me it was temporary. Just until things got sorted out, they said, family services needed to place him somewhere safe, somewhere familiar. I didn't wait for the paperwork. Before they even finished asking, my answer came out firmly. "I'll take him home." I was 25. I wasn't prepared. I didn't have extra savings. I didn't have a second bedroom. I didn't have a husband or even a boyfriend to lean on. What I had was love. A stubborn, relentless kind of love that didn't care about logic or finances or practicality. All I knew was that Aiden needed me. The following years were nothing short of a storm. I picked up every available shift at the hospital and worked weekends at the Maplewood care home, doing everything from feeding patients to cleaning floors. I skipped vacations because there was no one else to watch Aiden. I skipped dates because no man seemed interested in a young woman raising a child who wasn't biologically hers. My social life vanished. My personal dreams dissolved. I didn't buy new clothes. I cut my own hair in the bathroom mirror with rusty scissors. I stretched every dollar until it frayed at the edges. Every single decision revolved around Aiden's needs. When other children had toy stores and birthday parties, Aiden had cardboard castles I built from discarded boxes, shoebox dioramas painted with dollar store watercolors, and superhero costumes sewn from my old nursing scrubs. His Batman cape was made from a pair of scrub pants I'd stitched together late at night, my fingers aching after back-to-back shifts. People in town called me that girl who took in her sister's boy. They said it like it was something extraordinary, like I deserved a medal. I didn't see it that way. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was just trying to be a safe place for a little boy who had lost everything. As the years passed, the lines blurred. He stopped calling me Aunt Gloria when he was around strangers, but at home it stuck. That word, aunt. It used to sting like a little pinch, reminding me I wasn't his mother, but I told myself it didn't matter. I was there when he woke up scared at night. I was there when he scraped his knees, when he brought home crayon drawings from school, when he lost his first tooth. I was there for every fever, every triumph, every heartbreak. Some nights I wondered if I should have pushed harder, asked him to call me Mom. But I never wanted him to feel forced, to feel like I was erasing his parents. So I let it be. I accepted Aunt Gloria even when it felt like a half-truth. Time moved in small, measured moments. First days of school, homemade lunches packed with little notes inside, weekend trips to the park when I could squeeze them in between shifts, Christmas mornings when the gifts were few but the hugs were plenty. I didn't have a big life, but I had a full one. And in my heart, Aiden was always my son, even if the world saw me as just his aunt. Every decision I made, every sacrifice, every sleepless night was for him. And I told myself that was enough. I didn't need flowers on Mother's Day. I didn't need grand gestures. I just wanted a small corner in his heart, a quiet acknowledgement that he had someone who gave up everything so he wouldn't feel alone. I didn't need the title. I didn't need the word mom. I just needed to matter. And for most of my life, I truly believed I did. When Aiden left for college, I thought life would finally slow down, if only a little. The extra shifts became fewer, and I could finally breathe without counting every dime. There was even a little quiet pride watching him carry those overstuffed duffel bags into the dorms, seeing him step into the next chapter of life. I told myself the years of sacrifice were paying off, that I had done my job. But deep down, something else quietly settled in my chest. An ache I couldn't quite name. At first, it was just the expected things. Fewer phone calls, missed dinners during school breaks, busy weekends filled with new friends and new routines. I tried not to take it personally. Kids grow up, that's how it's supposed to be. I convinced myself every mother goes through this. But with each visit, each quick hug before rushing back to campus, the space between us grew a little wider. Then came Sierra Dawson. I remember the first time Aiden mentioned her. He'd come home for Thanksgiving break his sophomore year, the first time in months I had seen him. His hair was longer, his laugh more restrained, and his wardrobe noticeably sharper. He casually mentioned meeting someone amazing, he said. Sierra Dawson. Her name sounded like it belonged on the front of a fashion magazine. A few weeks later, they visited together. I cooked Aiden's childhood favorite baked ziti, even bought a little extra wine, wanting to make a good impression. Sierra arrived with perfect posture, flawless makeup, and a coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She smiled, politely said all the right things, but there was a chill beneath her manners. Her eyes didn't linger on family photos, didn't ask questions about the house, or the little traditions Aiden and I used to share. Her smile stopped at her teeth, never reaching her eyes. I noticed the subtle glances she exchanged with Aiden when I spoke, the way her hand would lightly rest on his wrist when I mentioned anything too simple, too small town. When I talked about Maplewood, her lips twitched like she was swallowing a joke. I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe I was being too sensitive, clinging too tightly to the boy I had raised. But something inside me knew. This wasn't just a girlfriend. This was a tide pulling Aiden further from shore. As the months turned into years, the phone calls dwindled. From weekly check-ins, we moved to hurried monthly updates. Our conversations became transactional. He'd call when he needed documents for student loans or questions about medical insurance. No more funny little anecdotes from campus life. No more asking how my week was. The warmth was fading, slipping between our fingers like sand. I started hearing more about Sierra's world than Aiden's. Dinners with her family at upscale restaurants. Beach trips to her family's coastal home. Her father's connections at an architecture firm where Aiden later interned. It was as if my years of sacrifice were being replaced, overwritten by polished, glossy new memories I wasn't part of. One Christmas, Aiden brought Sierra home again. I remember the dinner vividly, mostly because Sierra barely touched the roast I had spent hours preparing. She mentioned her plant-based diet casually, then spoke at length about her firm's charity gala and the networking opportunities it provided. Aiden sat there nodding along, beaming with admiration. My home felt smaller that night, like a place he was tolerating for obligation's sake, rather than a haven he wanted to return to. After they left, I found myself standing alone in the kitchen, the clock ticking louder than usual. The once vibrant kitchen filled with crafts and midnight study sessions now just felt quiet and hollow. Later came the offhand comments that pierced deeper than I expected. Aiden calling from their shared apartment, laughing softly. Sierra thinks it's cute how I used to live in a tiny house with mismatched furniture. Or, her parents offered to help us get a proper place, something more modern, you know. Each word landed like a stone, weighing down the memories I had once cherished. The meals I had skipped to buy him school supplies, the nights I worked doubles to save for his textbooks, the countless ways I had built that tiny house into a home for him, all reduced to something cute and quaint. I never confronted him. What was I supposed to say? That I felt the walls closing in. That every time he visited I saw less of my boy and more of a stranger wearing his face. Instead, I smiled through the phone calls, asked polite questions about Sierra's job, nodded along when he spoke of their travels and achievements. I stayed the quiet supporter even when my heart ached with every conversation, and on some nights sitting by myself I would quietly ask the question that made my chest feel tight, my eyes sting. Did I become an afterthought in the very life I worked so hard to build? Was I becoming a stranger in the only home I had ever known? Was I already being erased? I can still remember the exact moment I found out Aiden was engaged. It wasn't through a joyful phone call or a visit filled with excited smiles and trembling hands showing me a ring. No, it was a notification on my phone. A photo that popped up on my feed while I was standing in line at the grocery store. There they were, Aiden and Sierra, standing in front of a glowing skyline. Her hand stretched forward, diamond sparkling, like it had its own spotlight. The caption read, "She said yes," followed by a stream of hearts and champagne emojis. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen, half a loaf of bread clutched in my hand, the world spinning a little too fast. I read the caption 3 times, blinking back the sting behind my eyes. Surely there had been some mistake. Maybe Aiden had tried to call, maybe I missed it. But my call log was empty. My messages were blank. I was just another person scrolling through the internet, learning about my own son's milestone alongside strangers. I drove home in silence that evening, the groceries forgotten on the passenger seat. My hands trembled as I made myself tea, trying to quiet the storm in my chest. I kept telling myself maybe he was caught up in the excitement, maybe the phone call would come later, maybe tomorrow, maybe this weekend. But the call never came. Over the next few weeks, the updates continued, but never from Aiden. I saw engagement party photos online, a beautiful spread at a vineyard, Sierra's parents standing proudly beside the couple. No invitation ever arrived in my mailbox. No call, no text, not even a mention. I found out about their new apartment from a neighbor who happened to overhear Sierra chatting at the farmer's market. They had moved into a modern loft downtown closer to Sierra's office, with her parents helping with the down payment. Meanwhile, I was still living in the house where Aiden took his first steps, where I spent decades patching up broken pipes and saving every penny to keep a roof over our heads. Every time my phone rang, my heart jumped for a second, hoping it was him, only to feel the dull ache when it wasn't. When Aiden did call, it was only when he needed something. Documents for the apartment lease, a copy of his birth certificate, or questions about taxes. His voice was always rushed, distracted, more like someone handling a chore than talking to the woman who had raised him. Once I tried asking gently, "How's the wedding planning going?" His answer was clipped. "It's been busy." Sierra's family is handling most of it. There was no mention of me, no offer to include me, not even a polite lie to soothe my feelings. The bitterness that settled in my chest wasn't instant. It built slowly, like drops of water filling a bucket. Every silent milestone, every forgotten moment, every hollow phone call piled up until it felt suffocating. I kept telling myself to be patient, that he was just busy, that weddings could be overwhelming. I repeated the same old line I'd told myself 100 times. Just help him build his life, that's enough. But it wasn't. Because every photo I saw was a reminder that I wasn't part of the family dinners at Sierra's parents' house. Every update about their apartment, every story about a bridal shower I wasn't invited to, each one chipped away at the quiet pride I used to hold. I wasn't just in the background. I was completely outside the frame. Then came the final sting. A neighbor's daughter who worked part-time at a local events company mentioned they had catered Sierra's bridal shower. I smiled politely, pretending I had just missed it, but inside something twisted painfully. I hadn't missed anything. I was never even told it was happening. I sat alone at my kitchen table that night, staring at the same 4 walls that once echoed with Aiden's laughter. I traced the patterns on the worn tablecloth, memories flooding back of school projects we'd done together, of birthday cakes baked with cheap icing and crooked candles. And now the boy I raised with every ounce of love I had was living a life where I was nothing more than a distant obligation. It was the first time in my life I allowed the question to fully form inside me, sharp and heavy. When did I stop being the first person he wanted to call? When did I become invisible in the very life I helped build? And worst of all, was I ever really meant to be part of his new world? Or had I simply been left behind, quietly erased without anyone noticing? It was a Tuesday afternoon when Aiden showed up at my doorstep unannounced. I hadn't seen him in weeks, maybe longer. I was in the middle of folding laundry when I heard the knock, my heart leaping before my mind could catch up. I smoothed my hair, wiped my hands on my jeans, and opened the door with a hopeful smile. Aiden didn't hug me. His glance swept through the house like he was visiting a motel room he had stayed in years ago. He sat down on the same old couch I bought when he was in high school, legs spread out, phone in hand, tapping at the screen while mumbling something about wedding stress. I waited, half expecting him to ask how I was, to tell me something, anything, about his life. But there was none of that. Then, without preamble, he said, "We've found the perfect venue." His words hung in the air, and I stood there unsure how to respond. My smile lingered out of habit. He continued, "It's everything Sierra wanted. Rooftop city skyline, really classy." I nodded, feeling that tightening in my chest, a familiar pressure I'd known for years. I was about to offer a polite congratulations when his next sentence landed like a slap. "We're a little short, though," he said casually, eyes still glued to his phone. "Sierra's parents already put down a good chunk. We just need a little more, around 12,500. I blinked, sure I'd misheard. My mouth felt dry. "Dollars?" I asked quietly. He nodded like it was the most natural thing in the world, like he was asking me to borrow a cup of sugar. "Yeah, Mom. I mean, Aunt Gloria. You always said you wanted me to have a beautiful wedding. This is it." There it was again, that subtle correction. Mom. No Aunt Gloria. The same correction that had trailed me for decades. But in that moment it didn't matter nearly as much as the number echoing in my head. $12,500. I sat down, feeling the weight of those words pressing down on my shoulders. That was my emergency fund. The savings I had tucked away after years of extra shifts, after skipping vacations, after ignoring the leaky faucet for another season because the money was better off saved. It wasn't just money. It was my safety net. My health had been steady, but who knew what tomorrow might bring? That money was for doctor visits, maybe home repairs, maybe something as simple as breathing room during retirement. It wasn't meant for flower arches and open bars and Instagram-worthy wedding photos. But Aiden didn't seem to see it that way. He leaned back completely at ease, tapping his foot against the coffee table. "Sierra's parents already covered most of the cost," he said again, as if that justified everything. "It's just your part we're missing. Your part." I swallowed back the lump rising in my throat. I wanted to ask what part. The part where I stayed up all night sewing his Halloween costumes when I couldn't afford store-bought ones. The part where I worked double shifts while other mothers were at school recitals. The part where I gave up any hope of my own family to give him one. But I said nothing. I listened. And he spoke, rattling off costs, the vision Sierra had, how it would be a once-in-a-lifetime moment. Not once did he ask if I could afford it. Not once did he ask if I'd be okay after. It was already assumed decided. I was just another contributor to the dream. I stared at him, this grown man, who I had once held in my arms through fevers and heartbreaks, and I realized something I had been too afraid to admit. He wasn't asking out of love or consideration. He was expecting it, entitled to it, because that's what I had taught him all his life, that I would always be there quietly, providing, quietly sacrificing, never asking for anything in return. My hands trembled slightly in my lap, fingers twisting into the fabric of my old sweatpants. I forced myself to smile, the same trained smile I'd worn for years, and said, "Let me think about it." Aiden stood up without hesitation, kissed the top of my head out of habit, and said, "Thanks. I knew you'd understand. Sierra will be relieved. We already reserved the date." That night I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, heart twisting painfully. My emergency savings were supposed to be for my future, not for a wedding I wasn't even included in. But the thought of letting Aiden down made my stomach churn. Old habits die hard. I'd spent a lifetime putting him first. It was the only language I knew. The next morning, I dressed in my best blouse, brushed my hair into a neat bun, and drove to the bank. The teller smiled politely as I withdrew every last cent from my savings account. She didn't ask why, but her expression lingered on me a little longer than usual. Maybe she could sense it, the quiet despair under my polite nod. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table, my fingers tracing the edges of the check I had written. $12,500. My safety net, my security, my comfort in old age, gone. I sat there for hours alone, the clock ticking the house, unnervingly quiet. In my hands lay a check meant to buy someone else's dream, funded by my years of sacrifice. And for the first time in my life, I looked around my house, my life, and asked myself a question that had been too painful to confront. Who would be there for me when I had nothing left? The wedding day arrived quicker than I expected, though. In truth, I had been counting down the days with a quiet, sinking heart. I stood in front of the mirror that morning, smoothing the soft coral dress I'd bought after much hesitation. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple design, modest, with a color that gave my skin a bit of warmth. I'd even curled my hair and dabbed on a touch of lipstick, the same shade I used to wear years ago before life and responsibility dulled me down. I reminded myself this was Aiden's big day, that my job was to smile, to show up, and stay out of the way. The venue was breathtaking. Tall glass windows overlooking the river, golden accents lining the walls, elegant centerpieces on every table. Everything screamed luxury grandeur, a picture-perfect moment. The guests arrived in waves, polished shoes, designer dresses, glasses of champagne in hand. They mingled, laughed, toasted to a future that felt light years away from the world I had lived in. I tried not to feel out of place as I checked in at the reception table. The young woman behind the list barely glanced at me before pointing toward the far corner of the hall. "Table 21, she said briskly, already moving on to the next guest. When I reached my assigned seat, my breath caught for a moment. It was tucked near the back, close to the kitchen doors, where servers bustled in and out, carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres. My name was written in delicate calligraphy, but misspelled. Gloria. Just another forgotten detail in a day that seemed perfectly orchestrated for everyone else but me. I sat down, straightened my posture, and folded the cloth napkin across my lap. From where I sat, I could barely see the main stage where Aiden and Sierra stood beneath a floral arch. Every once in a while, I caught glimpses of them through the swaying crowd, their laughter ringing out, their joy palpable. I tried to convince myself that was enough. Aiden was happy. That's all I'd ever wanted. But as the evening unfolded, the ache in my chest only grew heavier. I wasn't invited into photographs, not included in the small group toasts, not acknowledged during the intimate family moments. Sierra's parents were front and center, their smiles wide, arms wrapped tightly around the couple. The guests hovered around them, showering them with compliments, admiration, importance. Then came the speeches. I braced myself as the DJ tapped the microphone, inviting the newlyweds to address their guests. Aiden stood tall, hand comfortably placed on Sierra's waist, his smile broad, his posture relaxed. I felt a twinge of pride. He looked every bit the confident young man I had raised. My chest fluttered, wondering if maybe, just maybe, he would glance my way, mention me even briefly. A simple thank you would be enough. His voice echoed through the room, steady and strong. Tonight wouldn't have been possible without the love and support of our families. He began pausing as the crowd offered polite applause. But I want to take a moment to give special thanks to someone who has been a rock through all of this. I sat up a little straighter, my fingers clutching the napkin tightly. My real mother, he continued, his eyes locking onto someone across the room. But it wasn't me. He turned toward Pamela Dawson Sierra's mother, who sat at the main table, glowing in a midnight blue gown. A proud smile spreading across her flawless face. Pamela Aiden said warmly, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for welcoming me into your family, for treating me like your own son, for being the steady presence we needed to make this day so special. I'm so lucky to have you. The applause that followed was thunderous. Guests rose to their feet. Glasses clinked, cameras flashed. I sat frozen, my smile strained, my hands locked together in my lap. The room around me blurred as if I were watching from underwater, muffled and distant. I swallowed the lump in my throat. My eyes darting around the room, but no one looked my way. No one noticed the woman in the corner, the woman who had given everything so this young man could stand there, tall and proud. Inside, I felt something rupture. Not an explosion. Just a quiet, clean break, like the snap of a brittle branch under too much weight. I held my smile. I had trained myself too well to fall apart in public. I kept my back straight, my chin high, and clapped softly along with everyone else. But for the first time, I wasn't just disappointed. I wasn't just hurt. I was done. As Aiden kissed Sierra on the dance floor, and Pamela wiped away a tear of joy, I sat quietly in my chair, the coral fabric of my dress pooling around my legs. I realized I was no longer an honored guest in his life. I was a shadow tucked into a forgotten corner, expected to watch silently while others took my place. And in that moment, a voice stirred within me, quiet but firm. I don't have to live like this anymore. When I got home that night, I didn't take off my shoes. I didn't turn on the television or make myself tea. I simply sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the coral fabric of my dress pooled around my legs. My chest felt hollow, like a room with all the furniture stripped away, leaving nothing but walls and echoes. The silence inside the house pressed down heavier than it ever had. I sat there until the sky outside turned from twilight to black, my thoughts swirling like a storm cloud refusing to pass. My eyes wandered across the familiar shadows of my room and landed on the old wooden dresser in the corner. Beneath it, hidden for decades, taped to the underside of the bottom drawer, was a yellowing envelope. I knew it was there. I had placed it there years ago, but I had never felt the need to open it. It was labeled in my father's handwriting, "For emergencies only." My hands moved without thinking. I peeled the tape away, feeling the brittle paper give under my fingers. Inside was a small brass key that belonged to an old lockbox in the hallway closet, tucked behind winter coats and forgotten holiday decorations. My father had always believed in quiet preparation. He didn't believe in flashy spending or dramatic gestures. Nas. His words echoed in my mind. The loudest wealth is the weakest. Stay quiet, stay ready. Dragging the box to the kitchen table, I sat down, my heart beating steadily. Not fast, not nervous, just steady. The lock clicked open easily. Inside were layers of documents neatly stacked, untouched for years. There were savings bonds from decades ago, bank statements with tidy handwritten notes, stock certificates I had forgotten about, land deeds from the small plot near Oak Ridge my father had purchased back in the 60s. The numbers had grown quietly over the years, investments compounding while I was busy surviving. One by one, I tallied it all up. My father's life savings. The modest investments I continued in his name, the dividends reinvested year after year. There were no luxury cars or extravagant vacations hiding in these numbers, just quiet, patient growth. By the time I finished, my hands resting flat on the worn wood table, the total sat at just over $320,000. I leaned back in my chair, blinking at the figure. For years, I had thought of myself as scraping by, living paycheck to paycheck, sacrificing every little bit for Aiden. I had worn the same shoes until the soles thinned, turned down. Vacations skipped every indulgence. I had convinced myself I was poor because my money had always gone to keeping Aiden safe, fed, educated, loved. I had never asked what would happen if I spent some of it on myself. But now, sitting in the quiet of my house, I realized I wasn't poor. I was simply conditioned to believe I didn't deserve to use the resources I had. My life had been centered around someone else for so long that I forgot I had a life of my own. The next morning, I called Mr. Franklin Cole, my father's old attorney. He was in his early 70s now, gray at the temples, but still sharp-eyed and soft-spoken. I scheduled a meeting, and 2 days later I walked into his office with a box of documents and a new determination anchoring my steps. "Gloria, what can I help you with today?" he asked, adjusting his glasses. "I'd like to make some changes to my will," I said calmly. "Mr. Cole looked at me thoughtfully. "Would you like to add someone?" "No," I replied, my voice steady. "I'd like to remove someone." He nodded without judgment. Simply opened a fresh file and prepared to take notes. I explained everything. Every detail I had kept bottled inside. I told him about Aiden, about the wedding, about the life I had sacrificed, and the way I had been cast aside. For the first time, I said the words out loud, letting them leave my chest like releasing steam from a boiling kettle. When I finished, I felt lighter, calmer, clearer. Mr. Cole flipped through the old will and crossed out Aiden's name from every account, every asset, every deed. Then, at my instruction, we drafted the creation of a new scholarship fund, a quiet, meaningful legacy. It would be called the Benson Foundation in honor of my father, dedicated to supporting single adoptive mothers who raised children against all odds, who were never called mom, but acted like one every single day. No fanfare, no public recognition, just quiet help for women like me. As I signed the final page, Mr. Cole placed a hand gently on mine and said, "This is the soundest decision I've seen someone make in a long time, Gloria." I left his office with a renewed steadiness in my step. The sun was shining brighter than it had in days, maybe weeks. The warmth hit my face, and for a fleeting moment I smiled. Not for anyone else, but for myself. For the first time in my life, I was making a choice solely for me. And it felt right. It felt free. It didn't take long after that meeting with Mr. Cole for me to make my next decision. I had lived in the same house for over 30 years, a place once filled with bedtime stories, school projects, and birthday cakes baked from scratch. But lately it had become a monument to sacrifice each worn corner, a reminder of what I had poured into someone else's life while forgetting to live my own. I realized I no longer needed to cling to a space that only remembered me as a provider, a caretaker, a silent observer. I wanted more. Within a few weeks, I quietly put the house on the market. No announcements, no discussions with neighbors, no long explanations, just a simple listing, a couple of visits, and a fair offer. I accepted without hesitation. The house sold faster than I expected, almost as if the universe itself was telling me it was time to move on. I took my time choosing my new place. I didn't look for practicality, for resale value, or for good school districts. For the first time, I asked myself, what do I want? What makes me feel at peace? The answer surprised me. I found a penthouse apartment in the neighboring city, bright, airy, with tall windows that overlooked the river sunlight that poured in every morning, and just enough space for me to live comfortably without feeling trapped by old memories. Walking through the empty apartment, the first time I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Possibility, freedom, the joy of starting fresh. I bought furniture that I loved, soft, cream-colored couches that hugged my back just right, a cozy reading nook with a plush chair, and a floor lamp that curved like a gentle question mark. Light curtains that danced in the morning breeze. For the first time in my life, I didn't shop for practicality or second-hand deals. I bought what I wanted, what made my home feel like a reflection of me. I decorated the walls with art that spoke to me. Not family portraits or reminders of people who had overlooked me, but soft landscapes, calming blues, and elegant touches of gold. I filled the kitchen with warm ceramics, little potted plants that thrived in the morning light, and a set of dishes I had admired for years but always deemed too nice for myself. Every corner, every detail of that apartment whispered one thing: this was mine. I settled into my new life quietly. No dramatic statements, no grand declarations on social media, just quiet mornings with fresh coffee, long walks along the river evenings reading by the soft glow of my lamp. I had never realized how much peace there was in simply choosing yourself, in not asking anyone's permission to be happy. Then, one Thursday afternoon, my phone rang. It was the concierge from the front desk. "Mrs. Benson," he said politely, "you have guests. Mr. and Mrs. Benson. They're asking to come up." I blinked, surprised. Aiden and Sierra. Curiosity tugged at me, but I kept my voice calm. "Send them up," I replied. Minutes later, I heard the knock. When I opened the door, Aiden stood there, dressed sharply. Sierra at his side in designer heels and a tailored coat. Their eyes widened the moment they stepped in. They looked around slowly, taking in the tall ceilings, the open view of the skyline, the carefully chosen furniture, the soft touches that made this place feel like a quiet sanctuary. This is your place?" Aiden asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Sierra's eyes traced the details: the gleaming kitchen counters, the modern art on the walls, the thick, comfortable rugs underfoot. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but she stayed silent, too stunned to find words. I stood there, peaceful, calm, feeling no need to fill the silence. Aiden looked at me, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. How did you? I smiled softly, feeling lighter than I had in years. "You never asked about my life, Aiden." I said, my tone gentle, unbothered. So I didn't feel the need to explain it. For a brief moment, there was only quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when people realize they've overlooked something important. They had spent years building a life where I was a distant afterthought, a silent figure expected to show up and give, never to be celebrated or considered. And now standing in front of them was proof they had no idea who I really was, or what I had built without them. Aiden shifted uncomfortably, glancing around again. Sierra pressed her lips together, her pride faltering. I didn't gloat. I didn't explain. I didn't offer them tea or invite them to sit. I stood tall, feeling the strength of my choices fill the room like sunlight. They had come expecting to find the same woman they had always known, a woman sitting in a small, worn-out house waiting for scraps of attention. Instead, they found someone they no longer recognized, someone who had finally chosen herself. And it felt incredible. After that visit, the silence didn't last long. The very next day, my phone buzzed with a message from Aiden. A simple, hesitant greeting. "Hey, Mom. Aunt Gloria. Can we talk?" I stared at the screen for a while before turning the phone over on the table, letting it go dark. It was the first of many messages. They came one after another. Texts, voicemails, missed calls. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Everything I had to say had already been spoken in my quiet choices. Each notification felt like echoes bouncing off walls I had built for my own peace. And for once I didn't feel obligated to respond, to soothe, to comfort. I let the silence speak for me. A few days later, Aiden's messages changed from casual greetings to apologies. Long paragraphs about how he had been thoughtless, how things had gotten out of hand, how he never meant to make me feel erased. I read them one by one without replying. I didn't need apologies whispered in private behind closed doors. I had lived my entire life in the shadows of silence. If there was to be an apology, it would be spoken where the disrespect had been most visible. Out loud, in front of the same world that had watched me be dismissed. It wasn't long before Aiden asked, "What do you want from me?" "Mom, tell me how I can fix this." The answer came to me without hesitation. "I want a public apology." I typed back the first response I had given him in days. No excuses, no explanations, just the truth, on camera, in your own words. There was a long pause after I sent it. Hours without a reply, then a message that simply said, "That's humiliating." I placed my phone down, folded my hands in my lap, and let the stillness wash over me. I didn't need to say anything more. He could either make it right or continue pretending nothing had happened. The choice was his. A week later, a video appeared on his social media account. It wasn't a flashy production or a scripted spectacle. It was just Aiden sitting alone in what looked like his home office, dressed plainly, no filters, no music. His eyes were tired voice, quieter than I remembered. He started with a deep breath, then spoke. "I need to say something publicly because I made my mother's love invisible for far too long." I listened as he admitted what had never been spoken before. He spoke about my sacrifices, how I had raised him when no one else would, how I had given up everything to make sure he never lacked for anything, how I had built a home from nothing, and offered him a future without ever asking for anything in return. He spoke about how easily he had fallen into the comforts of Sierra's world, how quickly he had let himself forget where he came from, who had been there through every scraped knee, every heartbreak, every late-night worry. His voice cracked when he said I erased the woman who saved my life, who gave me a family when I had none. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't shift blame. He simply told the truth raw and exposed for everyone to see. I watched the video once seated in my quiet apartment, sunlight streaming through the tall windows, the world outside carrying on as usual. My heart felt heavy but not broken. It was strange. There were no tears, no dramatic feelings of victory. Just a quiet confirmation of what I had always known. My sacrifices had been real, my love had been unconditional, and my absence had power. When the video ended, I closed my laptop gently. I didn't replay it. I didn't forward it to anyone. I didn't feel the need to read the comments that flooded in, the strangers shocked by Aiden's confession, the people defending me, criticizing him, debating the story they only knew in pieces. That apology wasn't for the internet. It wasn't for redemption in the eyes of the world. It was for me, to acknowledge what had been taken for granted for so long. And as I stood up to open the window, letting in the fresh breeze, I felt something settle peacefully inside me. I wasn't angry, I wasn't vengeful, I was free. Forgiveness. I realized didn't mean inviting people back into your life. Forgiveness meant releasing the burden from your own heart. And I had no intention of reopening doors that had led to my suffering. The apology was enough. Closure was enough. I didn't need to go back. I didn't want to go back. Because my life, this life I was building, was finally mine. Life after the apology didn't feel like a sudden transformation. There was no grand revelation, no overnight makeover. It was quieter than that. Gentler, like a slow morning where sunlight peeks through your curtains and warms your face before you even open your eyes. I didn't realize it at first, but I was becoming someone new, someone who had permission finally to live for herself. I signed up for a yoga class at a small studio 2 blocks from my new apartment. At first I felt self-conscious, awkward in my movements, unsure if I belonged in a room full of women who seemed so graceful, so at ease. But week by week, my body softened, my breathing slowed, and for the first time in decades, I felt connected to myself. Not as a mother, not as a caregiver, not as a giver of endless sacrifices, but as a woman simply existing in her own body. I started painting again. I had loved art as a girl, sketching wildflowers in notebooks, doodling in the margins of schoolwork. But life had pushed that aside, replacing it with grocery lists and utility bills. I found a local community class, Magbatsi. Casual, welcoming, no pressure to be good, just encouragement to create. I bought a set of watercolor paints, clean white canvases, brushes that felt soft in my hand. My first painting was clumsy, the colors blotchy, but I loved it. Every brushstroke felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd long forgotten. Travel, too, became part of my world. I had spent years watching travel shows from a faded living room couch, dreaming about places I thought I would never see. But now, I didn't have to dream. I booked my first trip, a quiet seaside town with quaint cafes and art galleries. I walked cobblestone streets, listened to ocean waves, ate pastries without worrying about calories or judgment. No itinerary, no one else's preferences to consider. Just me, my pace, my choices. And it was beautiful. Days bled into weeks and weeks, into months, and something extraordinary happened. I stopped checking my phone constantly. I no longer waited for calls that once made my stomach twist. Messages from Aiden still came, sometimes short updates, sometimes lingering apologies. I responded when I wanted to, not when I felt obligated. I didn't keep score of how many times he reached out or how long he stayed silent. I let the distance exist where it belonged, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty about it. There were no more anxious nights spent wondering what I had done wrong, no more trying to decode cold messages or half-hearted invitations. I realized I no longer needed to explain myself to anyone, especially not to those who only saw my worth when it was convenient for them. I filled my mornings with slow breakfasts on the balcony, breathing in crisp air while the city hummed softly below. I read books I had always meant to, sometimes letting whole afternoons slip away in the company of fictional worlds. I wandered farmers' markets, took afternoon naps, sat by the river sketching passing boats, and relished every single moment of it. The freedom wasn't loud or showy. It was found in the simplest things, in deciding what to eat, where to go, how to spend my day. It was in not feeling like a ghost, lingering in the background of someone else's life. It was in understanding that my time, my energy, my love were no longer automatic offerings to anyone who asked, but gifts I could choose to give, or keep. One morning while stretching on my yoga mat, I realized something that made me smile to myself. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter or vengeful or waiting for anyone to redeem themselves. I didn't need apologies or validation or promises of change. What I had now was far more valuable: peace. I had made a life that belonged solely to me, stitched together from forgotten dreams and rediscovered joys. And in that quiet, content space, I learned something precious. Sometimes the happiest ending isn't found in revenge or recognition. It's found in freedom. In finally living a life that feels light, whole, and completely unapologetically yours. A few days before my move to the coast, just as I was packing away the last of my winter clothes and sorting through old photo albums, a simple white envelope arrived in my mailbox. There was no return address, just my name written in a familiar slanted script I hadn't seen in years. Aiden's handwriting. For a brief second I stood frozen in the hallway, fingers grazing over the edges of the envelope, debating whether to open it or simply tuck it away, like so many other forgotten things. But curiosity won. I walked over to my kitchen table, cleared a small space between the moving boxes, and carefully opened the envelope. Inside were 3 handwritten pages, no typed text, no rehearsed words. Just ink, slightly uneven sentences scratched out and rewritten as if every word had been wrestled from somewhere deep within him. His letter wasn't an apology, at least not in the traditional sense. It wasn't filled with promises to do better or pleas for forgiveness. It was something different, quieter, more human. He wrote about memories I had long buried, moments I didn't think he remembered. He spoke of the nights I stayed up with him when he had the flu, the cardboard pirate ship I had crafted from old moving boxes, the Batman cape I stitched from my work scrubs. He wrote about the way I used to leave little notes in his lunchbox before big exams, how I'd wait up during high school dances, pretending to read while listening for the sound of the door unlocking. There were lines where his words trembled, where he admitted he had been unkind, blind, swallowed up by a world that convinced him love looked a certain way. Glossy, performative, attached to status. He didn't ask me to forgive him. He simply told me he finally saw it. The years I had built his world quietly, invisibly, without ever asking for applause. Near the end, his handwriting grew more uneven, the ink darker where his pen had pressed too hard. He wrote, "I don't know if I deserve to be part of your life anymore, but I wanted you to know. You were always my home, even when I forgot how to find my way back." I folded the letter slowly, smoothing down the creases with careful fingers. My chest felt full, not with sorrow, not with anger, but with something gentler, understanding. I didn't cry. I didn't ache. I simply felt peace. I walked over to the shelf in my living room where an old, worn frame sat, a photo of Aiden at 5 years old. His little arms wrapped around my neck, a crooked grin lighting up his whole face. That picture had followed me through every chapter, every home, every sacrifice. For years, it had been a symbol of my quiet devotion, a reminder of why I had worked myself to the bone. Now it was something else. I slid the letter behind the photo, tucking it safely out of sight, but not out of mind. Not to hold on to bitterness. Not to grant forgiveness. But to acknowledge the truth of it all. The love, the hurt, the years of silence, and the final recognition. As I packed the last of my things and walked through my apartment one last time, I felt no regrets. There was no lingering ache, no gnawing need to be seen by anyone else. I wasn't leaving to prove a point. I wasn't running away. I was simply choosing to live, fully honestly for myself. When I arrived at the coast, the air tasted different. Salty, fresh, clean. I opened the windows of my new home, letting the breeze carry away the remnants of an old life. I placed that same photo and letter on a quiet little shelf by the window where the afternoon sun would catch its edges, where it would simply exist, not as a symbol of pain, but as a quiet acknowledgement of my journey. And as I stood there breathing in the calmness, I realized something with stunning clarity. I had spent most of my life proving my love, proving my worth, proving my role. But the truth was, love never needed to be bought. It never needed to be proven through endless sacrifice. It simply was, pure and whole. And as for my worth, it was never up for debate. It was never tied to who accepted me, who acknowledged me, or who remembered to say thank you. Because I finally understood my worth had always been mine, and I never needed anyone's permission to claim it. If you've ever felt like your years of love and sacrifice were invisible, like your role in someone's life quietly faded without anyone noticing, I hope this story reminded you that your worth doesn't depend on anyone's approval. Have you ever been in a moment where you realized it was time to choose peace over pain? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your story in the comments below. And if you found comfort or strength in this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. That way you'll never miss another story of quiet strength, dignity, and rediscovered joy. You deserve to be reminded of your value, always.